Thank you. Thank you for having me. I love that you have the power broker up there on your shelf behind you.
It's all signaling. We're signaling
Yeah.
that I read the three body problem. Dune is there somewhere. And of course the power broker. So that's all gonna fit into all of the themes of the show. For those of you who are not keeping up with your book covers on my shelf, The Power Brokers by Robert Caro. It's about the building of New York City in the mid 20th century and really focuses on bureaucracy and all this stuff that seems super boring. But as we're going to get in today, all this stuff is incredibly important and deeply interesting to all of you who
Actually,
are
we
interested
can,
in this
yes, and
topic.
we can actually bring, I think we can actually bring the power broker into this without going into too much depth about its 600,000 words. It might even be longer than that, but it is long. I read it. I've read parts of it before, but I sat down and finally was like, okay, I'm going to do this during the pandemic. So, I mean, it's like longer than War and Peace. It is,
Yeah.
it is a mountain, but it's worth it.
It's the book put Robert Caro on the map. But we're here to talk about your book, Golden Gates, which is a book it came out during the start of the pandemic. And as every author knows, this was a terrible time for a book to come out. But you're in the useful and lucky category of this book is just going to get more relevant as time goes on. So this is something that we can revisit more than a year later. And everything is totally relevant. Everything still really matters. So in the preface to the new paperback edition, which we want people to check out, you really point out that you started this book with a question, which was basically, why is America's housing problem seemingly impossible to solve? So I want you to define something. What actually is the housing problem in the country right now?
So no, that's actually a great question. Maybe I should have started with that question in the new preface. And thanks again for having me. It's really great to be here. I love talking about housing. I think the problem is people spend too much on housing, and they can't. So too much of their income is going to housing. They're not able to invest, save, survive in the cases of the most unfortunate. And so that's a waste, and it's unfair, and there's social justice and other things attached to that. But at a basic level, it's people pay too much. And I think the other problem with housing is that because it costs too much, it's very difficult for people to organize their lives in the way that's best for them. So people can't, we know that school districts are very tied to housing. We know that where you can work and what kind of, job, how long it takes you to get to your job, what kind of job market you can access. All these things are very tied to housing. And obviously the Bay Area is the most dramatic example of this, which is why I focused on this in the book. It's a great test case. It's a great narrative. It's a great way to bring people into this in a way that helps them understand one place, but to use that as a window into all places, or a lot of places anyway. But if you look at the Bay Area, here's this area that has had tremendous job growth. It's creating the industrial age of our time. It's the jobs of the future, the training of the future. All these things are in places like that. I'm not trying to say the Bay Area is the only place in the world. I'm just saying these multi-trillion-dollar corporations are there, and they're creating the future, and they have the jobs that people say are the jobs we want people to be aspiring to. And yet people talk about the Bay Area as if it's some insane luxury to live there. Oh my God, you live in Bay Area, so expensive, right? And I just think that's unfair, because all of America has played a huge role in building these companies. They're all funded in some fashion or form by government research into the internet and Defense Department. I think I read somewhere that something like more than half the components in the iPhone are patents that the Defense Department can't, right? So our sort of collective, if you will, has created these kinds of companies, and yet living near them, getting in on the jobs and the wealth, and having an opportunity to get into a company like that, and get all the free healthcare or whatever, like all these things are seen as like a big luxury. Now, I don't want to overdo those companies. I just meant this accessing opportunity, be it in Nashville, Minneapolis, San Francisco, Seattle, Austin, whatever, is dependent on housing. And so whether it's we're spending too much, we're not able to organize our lives in a way that's good for us, or we're not able to access opportunity, I see that as our housing crisis. Now, of course, there's also a homelessness crisis and all that, which we can talk about at length. There's obviously chapters about that. But I mean, I think at a very large level, the reason why I think this is a national crisis that affects so many people is it has disrupted so many people's lives and made it harder for them to get ahead.
Yeah, and I want to get to homelessness in a quick second, but is there a difference between the housing, so purchasing a home, and then the rental part of this crisis? Anyone from the mid 2010s will remember the rent is too damn high as just a meme word that really mattered. So are these related? Are they the same thing? It would just be great to get some context on that.
Yeah, I mean, in the sense that they all have to do with the supply of housing and the market for housing and how easy it is to find, land prices and, how much shelter there is. I think that they're related in the sense that they're the same policy problem. Now, don't get me wrong, you could fiddle around the edges. There are people who will say, why are we building $10 million condos when we should be building affordable housing? Great question. I think that's a great area, to try to come up with policies that optimize what you think the market needs, right? But there is a scarcity of all kinds of housing, right? Actually, there's a scarcity of everything besides ultra luxury housing, which is actually, by all indications, oversupplied. But and so I think that they're the same, but they're obviously very different in the sense that renters never get ahead, so that they're kind of always dealing with the rent, whereas homeowners, once you're in, and we can talk about this in just a second, but once you're in, you are making money off the inflation. And that's part of the problem, which is that we see home appreciation as this big wealth building tool, and that's fine. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that. The forced savings of home ownership, as I don't know if you own a home, but if you do,
I do not. I rent in Williamsburg, so I'm very much
so
at the center of everything we're talking about.
Yeah, it's not just the appreciation, right? It's as you hopefully will learn one day, it's not just the appreciation, it's the forced savings. There are lots of reasons why home ownership is a good thing, right? But it also, I don't think we're better off as a society if you're getting like crazy rich off of it, off the appreciation anyway, because that sort of indicates that more and more people are being locked out. So are they the same? Yes, they're the same, but obviously there are differences in terms of who those people are. But I think the same phenomena are generally driving both of them. Depends on what level. If you want to be at 100,000 feet, yes, they're the same. If you want to be at 2 feet, they're completely different. But at a large kind of global economic level, they're sort of similar.
And you hinted at this a bit during your answer, but where does the debate over gentrification fit into everything you're just saying? So with you're building $10 million condos, but you're not building affordable housing. How does this all fit into that?
So let's just define gentrification for a moment, because this gets, a lot of people have a lot of arguments over this, right? Gentrification is basically wealthier people moving into a neighborhood that's less wealthy, and raising the rents and home prices based on the demand of this sort of outside group coming in, right? I think that's generally speaking, and the reason that's gentrification rather than say just the world is doing better or general wealth building. If everybody in a particular neighborhood was living in very good times, and all of a sudden all of them were making way more money and their homes and rents, and right, like that's kind of like what we want. I mean, we do want people moving in and out of neighborhoods just based on their own life preferences, but we don't want them feeling like they have to be pushed out of their own neighborhood, right? So that's gentrification. And gentrification you could also think of as, there's term filtering. So there's a term filtering in real estate, which basically means things can filter down, which means you have a home that used to be expensive is fallen into less repair, there's more homes in the area, whatever, and it becomes more affordable. But you could also have upfiltering, which is basically gentrification, which is that you have homes that were previously, affordable, and now they become higher because some outside group. So where does the housing, I believe, and a lot of people believe, that gentrification has a lot to do with the lack of supply in housing, that there's not enough affordable housing, but there's not enough of any housing. Now, I get in a lot of fights with people about this, both in real life and in Twitter. We still have a big income inequality problem in this country. Our cities have bifurcated in such a way that we've kind of fallen into one kind of higher end category of jobs, which are called knowledge jobs. People who use a computer in some way to multiply themselves, be they finance or technology. People like you, to some extent, entertainment. I mean, certainly large podcasters have gotten very wealthy because they can reach hundreds of millions of people, or millions of people with just sitting in a room with the power broker in the bookshelf in the back, right? But then there are people who do service work, clean homes, walk dogs, whatever, teach yoga classes. Now, some service people make a lot of money. Doctors are performing a service, right? But a lot of them are doing these in-person services. Now, what's significant about that in cities is the people who are doing these service jobs basically have to be there. They're essentially doing all the jobs that nobody automated yet, and can't be automated yet, right? So this kind of knowledge group that makes a lot of money and this service group that is effectively waiting on them have to live next to each other. So they have to occupy roughly the same housing market. And that income inequality has played a big role in hurting people at the bottom, right? That is definitely part of the equation. But I also think that the general lack of supply of housing at a lot of levels is part of the problem. And gentrification is a symptom of that, because it's basically showing you that wealthier people can't find something in their price range, and so they're going, down the ladder to find. They can't find a place, so they're going. Now we could get into all sorts of stuff about trendy neighborhoods and whatever, and I think that's a little part of it, but I don't think that's part of it on a very high level.
Can you answer then the critique of your position that you raised earlier, which is that if you just increase housing, you're just going to have a bunch of really expensive buildings for rich people to be built and not actually address the inequality issue you're hitting at?
Totally. So one of the things that comes up, particularly in the nuance-free space of Twitter, is that if somebody believes that America has a housing shortage, right, that they are somehow disbelieving that America has an income inequality problem, right? And that they are also somehow disbelieving that there isn't a good, in affordable housing, and that they're disbelieving that policy can push certain types of housing over others, right? And that's just not true. Like, meaning, I think you can believe that America has a housing shortage, and that increasing it with a mix of market rate housing and affordable housing, you can believe that. And for some reason, if you say, well, we have a housing shortage and that's the root cause of our problem, if you say that, you are suddenly a libertarian. You are an advocate of supply side economics. You are, you believe in trickle down everything, right? And I just kind of reject that. And I love podcasts because you don't have to be that person on a podcast. And I think it would be just as, that there are some zealots who will tell you that the only way we can solve this is massive amounts of public housing or supportive housing, that, that we need to get everybody needs to live in public housing, or, some version of that, right? But I think both of those polls are pretty much a minority view, that most people think, whether or not they really want it in their backyard or in their neighborhood or not is another matter, right? But I think most people agree that there is a a need for some amount of government support for people who can't afford what the private market is building, right? But that there's also a need for enough, but that there should be a robust private market for people who can afford it, right? You know, we don't want the government running and owning every single aspect of housing. And I don't mean that as some boogeyman thing. I just mean it would be a whole new job. It would change how everything works. You know, I don't, if we had built our system that way, maybe it would be fine. There are, you know, anyway, so I guess what I'm saying is the critique is usually a critique that says that you think build, and that'll solve everything. And I'm like, no, you're going to need universal Section 8 vouchers. You're going to need, you know, more affordable housing. You're going to need, you know, you should probably try to find ways to make total absentee buyers who buy $20 million condos that they've literally never been in. You want to make that a lesser part of the market to the extent that land is a scarce quantity, right? I think it's possible to hold all those positions, but on Twitter, you're not allowed to.
On this podcast, you are, though. So the last definition question I'm going to get to, and I don't want to sound crass, so push back if I'm not framing this the right way, but I often hear homelessness brought into the conversation we're having. And for me, at least in the year 2021, I'm a little confused because, for example, I used to live in DC up until 3 weeks ago. I just moved to New York. In DC, especially during the worst depths of the COVID pandemic, the people who you really saw on the streets, these were clearly people who had mental health issues, drug usage issues. So my reaction, these are not folks who would have been buying, purchasing, renting anything. So I don't understand how people tie the conversation we're having about affordability into that dynamic. So, for example, we all know the stories that definitely exist of dispossessed families or people who have housing insecurity. I get that part, but I don't understand how that tracks to homeless folks.
No, and I'm very happy you brought that up because that is a very commonly held position. That is a common belief. That is a common experience that you're walking down the street and you see someone who seems sick in various serious ways. And you can't even imagine how that person can go through the hoops of finding you know, applying for an apartment and, you know, showing up, right? You know,
price aside.
Yeah, no, or showing up to work to, you know, or anything, you know what I mean? Like, okay, here's the reality. And this is a reality. There is a paper that just came out by an economist named Bruce Meyer, who studies poverty at the University of Chicago. Very serious. He's absolutely not an advocate. You know what I mean? Like he is he finds about 50% of people who have experienced homelessness work. And by work means they file federal tax forms. He finds that only about a quarter of the homeless people have severe mental illness, right? I mean, if we start saying like anxiety, whatever, you know, which I mean, obviously crippling anxiety is different than like sort of, right, you know, but I mean, only about a quarter have like severe problems, right? You find that homeless people don't move around more than the general population. It's generally in line with it. You know, that they are usually from where they are homeless, right? So, and the thing is, if you spend a lot of time with homeless people, as I have spent, maybe not as many as some reporters, but a lot, you find that most of the people who are homeless are kind of good at being homeless. You don't see them. They don't go find the most crowded part of the city and just pitch a tent on the street there. You know, they find a place where they can sleep. They find you know, some kind of, you know, either a large homeless encampment in some cases. You know, there are people who pitch tents who are pretty normal, I guess. That's one of the things is as it becomes more normalized, you start to find a community, right? Okay, but so what I'm saying is that homelessness is a housing problem. Here's why. It used to be, I don't really remember this, and you definitely don't remember this, but it used to be that there were kind of bad sections of town. I hate saying that, but things that places of town that in movies were sort of portrayed as Skid Row, or the pawn shop is next, right? And they had these residential hotels, and these were hotels where people would spend $10 or whatever to get a room. The bathroom would not be in the room. It'd be like a communal bathroom in the hall, and I think you had to put your own sheets on it. They had like plastic on everything. Like not nice hotels. And at the time, of course, there was a debate about, is this not good enough for people and whatever, right? And there used to be tens of thousands of these kinds of units in cities around the country. And many of them were demolished to build the neighborhoods we think of today as the sort of nice, new, cool, redeveloped, gentrified neighborhoods, right? And I'm not using the term gentrified as a boogeyman there. I'm just sort of saying, and many things about those neighborhoods have obviously improved, right? That
quick interruption, because I'm almost 30. So if you're saying I don't remember, I couldn't remember what time period.
This would be like the
talking
70s.
about. Sound okay.
Okay. I wasn't trying to make you 22.
No, I just wanted, because I'm just trying,
I don't really
because you're
remember.
correct. Because you're correct that I can't remember this, but I'm like, when is this?
So actually, here's an example I always give in talks. Did you ever see, even though you are only 30, Big with Tom Hanks? A lot of people have seen that movie, even if they didn't see it in the theater. And of course, everyone remembers the piano key scene, right? But there's this other scene where he becomes big. He wakes up and he's big, and his mom thinks he's a stranger and an invader to their house. And anyway, and then he goes and tells his friend, and they sing the song, and his friend is like, "Whoa, that's really you," and whatever. Okay, and they have to figure out where he's gonna sleep, because he can't stay at his friend's house because he's like 30 now, and he can't stay at home. So they get like $12 or whatever a kid who's 12 or 10 or 15 or however they were in the movie. They get some small amount of money, and they take the bus from New Jersey to New York, and they get him a hotel, and they go to this terrifying looking hotel where this guy who's like bad teeth or something like burps at them, and then he goes like $5 or what, I forget what it was. Actually, we should go watch that. I could do it right now if you want to pause, but and he hands him the sheets, and then that night Tom Hanks goes to this room that has no bathroom, and he hears screaming, and I think he may hear a gunshot, I forget, and then he's so scared he pushes the dresser in front of the door and just like sits there and cries. Right now, that is a hotel that I don't know where it was, but let's say it was in the Bowery or someplace like that in New York. That you could imagine all of those people. Those are the people who would have been homeless if that very, very, very cheap option, didn't exist. Now, at that time, you could be like kind of like an occasional day laborer, and maybe have a drinking problem, and still find a room for like $10 or $12, or the what I mean? You could find the equivalent today of like a $300 to $400 a month apartment, right? Maybe a $500. I don't know. I'm not doing the perfect inflation here, but the point is, an option that someone with like a Social Security disability check, which is about $1,300, could just be like, could totally live month to month, not comfortably, not but with that, right? And that's one reason and homelessness, which the first real great study of homelessness was done in 1981 in New York, and the authors of the study, who are one of whom is still at Columbia today, they found that many of these people who they saw living on the streets had lived in residential hotels that were closed down as New York was redeveloping, right? And that same thing is true across the country. There's a guy who wrote a book called Living Downtown about Skid Row in Los Angeles, same conclusion. So I'm not saying that we have to have exactly these types of hotels or whatever, but my point is, you need some sort of radically cheap housing that somebody like on a Social Security disability check can afford. Now, will there still be a number of well, and let me also add that when you look at what sort of homelessness interventions work, they do all these studies. Does this work? Does that work? And then you find out, like, I was talking to a homeless researcher about this, Dr. Margot Kushel. She's at UCSF and is like this, world's expert in homelessness. And she always says, we do all these studies and we track all these things, but then you find out that in the middle, they got a $400 apartment. And she goes, sometimes I wonder, did any of the interventions matter more? Like, did any of the interventions about drug counseling or whatever matter at all? Or did what mattered was they got a $400 apartment, right? So if you start asking yourself, who are the people who are, I guess what I'm saying is that will there still be people who are unable to care for themselves in a multitude of ways, of which housing is just one? Will those people exist in a society, and have they always existed? Like, absolutely, right? Does that explain the scale of homelessness we have in America today? Like, not at all, right? And so I guess what I'm saying is that, yeah, mental health, drug addiction, a general kind of problem, a lot of homeless people I meet don't have the best family ties anymore, like, imagine if you had no one, you know what I mean? Like, beyond the depression, there's like safety net things, you know what I mean? Like, and so I guess what I'm saying is that the cost of housing is what pushes people into homelessness. It's not to say that they don't have, it's not like there's some, Harvard educated person that, has no mental health problems and great job prospects and then gets fired one day and is like, oh, I'm homeless. Like, yeah, of course that doesn't happen. And one of the things that I really struggle with and can't stand, frankly, is that when I write a story on homelessness, somebody basically complains like, oh, this person's an ex-con, or this person, is stupid with their money. Why doesn't this person do, and you're like, yeah, those things are all true, and yet they're still on the street. They're still in this tent. They're still, like, not everyone has, there are not perfect homeless people, but that doesn't mean they should be homeless.
I think this was such a useful bit of this episode that I want to highlight for people, just because when I was asking the question about mental illness, I was thinking, and I know very little about this issue, obviously, I was just thinking about the received narrative we all have around Reagan opening up the mental health hospitals in the psychiatric facilities in the 80s. I'm not saying that didn't happen, but I had no idea around the structural, non-related parts of that bit. So just once again, huge part to highlight for people. We've been really focusing on narratives here, and I want to take a step back then and focus on what the American housing narrative is. Because I had an experience, so I'm from Portland, Oregon. I went back last December, before, not even last, so the December before COVID, and I was hanging out with a friend, and we're hanging out, and he's mentioned, oh yeah, I'm renovating. And I go, why are you renovating? He goes, well, I just bought this house. And I was just shocked, because coming from DC, East Coast lives, I don't really know anyone who purchases a home, even though, like I said, I'm almost, 29, 30. So I'm in this cohort of people who, we're Henrys, we're, going to be upper middle class someday. Everything's great, but most of us are all still renting. And I was just thinking that from a historical perspective, like, that's kind of insane that I'm 29, 30 and I don't really know people who buy or own houses. So can you just place this within two things? So one, what do you think the American narrative around home ownership is today, especially in contrast to the 1950s stereotype of the white picket fence? Let's deracialize it too. Just totally remove the racial aspects of this. Just like the idea of like, hey, like, you get married, you're 22, you're 23, you got a nice house in the suburbs, you commute. What do you think it is today?
One of the things I bring up in the book, in the preface, not in the preface you're talking about, but the one that comes after it, is in 1945, Life magazine did this article on California. and they were trying to sort of project how American life would change after, as World War II ended. And they profiled three people in LA. One was a film composer who was rich, made like the equivalent of 700 or 800 grand a year in today's money. The other was like a salesperson who made, 120, 150 grand, which would be, pretty good, but middle class-ish, depending on what city you live in. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
Single earner or whatever, right? You can definitely have two teachers.
Tulsa, you're a king.
Yeah. Yeah, no, but you can definitely have two teachers who make that kind of money if they're double income. Anyway, it's two incomes in the family. And then a fireman, Leroy Loeffler, which I always remember him, who made the equivalent of 40 grand. Now, one of the things, they all lived in single family homes. They all had big yards. They all had now, obviously there were differences, but the differences between how they lived were not that great. You know what I mean? And I was just speaking to a woman the other day who was telling me about how her father was an aerospace engineer and they lived on this house with like the large backyard in the neighborhood. And the guy like next to them was like a milkman and he had like a small yard. And it's like, okay, that's like, this is how we calculate our differences in America. Like the engineer gets like a bigger yard and the milkman just has like a smaller yard, and that's inequality.
Yeah.
Right. Now, as you say, race is a huge piece of that. FHA loans, which these people, particularly the lower income, or the fireman guy, FHA loans had this thing called redlining. And as all my housing people know, redlining was basically a system in which the government specifically would not lend to Black neighborhoods or even mixed race neighborhoods. And so essentially you have a government program that like gave free money or gave lower interest loans to one group of people, not another group of people. And that explains a huge part of our segregation today. That one decision explains a huge amount of our wealth inequality today. Black and white families at that time, though white were obviously wealthier, it was nowhere near as big as it is today. And the sort of disparities in housing wealth, many of which were driven by that one decision, because that's how you got in. It explains a remarkable amount of our racial wealth gap. So it cannot be understated in terms of its legacy. You don't get to go back and say, oh, we can just undo that now. We don't have housing discrimination anymore.
And I just want to clarify something real quick, because I could have been too quick when I said this. My point wasn't that didn't, and you're not saying this.
Oh, no.
My point was not that racial disparities didn't matter. I was getting at the quote unquote ideal, but please go on.
Yes. Anyway, I guess what I'm saying is that is the picture of the ideal. Mm-hmm. That is the reality of what was going on in that time, is that there really was great inequality and upward mobility amongst a great many people, milkmen and aerospace engineers and stuff like that. But that Black people and Asian people, were in California, there were all sorts of rules specifically targeted at Asians, were excluded, right? Okay, so what does that dream look like today? I've thought a lot about that. I think that dream looks like either A, you are commuting to the, there's a large classes of people, you meet them in San Francisco who rent for life. You'll meet all sorts of teachers who get into a rent controlled apartment, they raise their kids in it, whatever. Now that's probably been true in New York for quite some time, because New York's got more of that because it's a denser environment, it's more expensive, right? So that's one thing. You're starting to see more cities. You meet people in LA and stuff like that who do that, which was not the case, say, 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. I think that you're starting to see more people live in duplexes and triplexes. I think you're starting to see more. You're seeing people move further to the exurbs. I mean, remember that option is already always there. I mean, there's still tons of people moving to the San Joaquin Valley, or the Central Valley of California, or Riverside County. So there are all these super commuters that go to LA every day from very far away. So those options are there. But I guess if I had to sum it all up, I would say there are fewer owners. It's harder to get in. The amount of money you have after rent is less. And there's less upward mobility. There's less ability to collect or to, there's less ability to get in and start to build wealth through, and on top of that, remember, there used to be people who were like kind of small time landlords and had like a little, one of the things
any like 1950s, 1960s movies had that character.
Well, but one of the things I always think about is that when you go talk to people of any race, any income, there's like a familiarity with the landlord. Like everyone's like, a lot of people have like kind of been landlords before. You know what I mean? Like even if even if they had like a lease and they had like a roommate situation, but they were sort of like the master roommate, or anyway, I'm just saying that a lot of these sort of opportunities for ownership and all that have gotten further and further from people's reach. Now, I should note, this is most intense in what we will call superstar cities or cities of opportunity or whatever. Now, I hate the term superstar city because it sort of implies that a place like San Francisco, Seattle, or New York are just so much better and more important than other cities. And that's not what it means.
Places there's this really bad meme within culture war circles of, well, these, blue cities, they're the ones with the highest GDP and they're producing everything. And it's other parts of the country. It just leads, thinking around those terms, to your point, just leads people to not productive areas.
Yeah. Well, although we could put some nuance on that since it's a podcast.
Yeah, please do.
But, no, what I'm saying is Minneapolis is a superstar city. Nashville is a superstar city. Austin is a superstar city. Boise, Idaho is a superstar city, right? Like, I don't think these people think of themselves as superstar cities, but these are cities with great job growth, great economies, high education, high level of kind of productive jobs, meaning jobs in knowledge industries, stuff like that, right? And that is what I think of as a superstar city. Portland is one of those, right? So cities that have that, some weird combination of high education and productive jobs, meaning like an industry like computers or something like that, in a growing industry, is a superstar city. And those are in red states and they are in blue states. Now, the little bit of nuance I would add to that is that they're overwhelmingly blue cities. Even Boise has a Democratic governor, or mayor, rather. And there has, of course, we could have a long talk about that. Well, no, I mean, it's funny. I mean, I'll just throw this out there. This is not a proven thing. This is just me thinking about this, if I was more of a Substack writer, I would probably write things about this, but I always feel like I can't do it unless I have like my whole thesis, but since it's a podcast, but I sometimes think to myself that the like culture of a growing, robust city is sort of like, you kind of want to get there and do your thing. You know what I mean? Like you left DC, you're moving to New York, you got your thing, you're very excited about it. You're sort of, you're working very hard, you're not like volunteering at the church. And not because you're young, you don't have enough time. Maybe you'll do that when you're older. I'm just sort of saying, right? There's like this real upward mobility thing, and maybe that's a problem with America, whatever, but that's like the culture of a lot of cities, right? But when you go to smaller towns, like people don't let people become homeless. They're like, oh, Johnny's got a problem and we all got to pitch in. And you know what I mean? Like, I don't even mean it like it has to be that small, but I just meant there are institutions like churches, there are local kind of communal institutions that are able to solve big problems because A, everyone cares, it's smaller, and B, you don't need a massive apparatus to do it, right?
No one's anonymous. Because that's the key thing.
Yeah. And I just think, well, and also you can, everyone can throw in $5 or whatever. Anyway, my point is that I think that there is something to this idea that when you get in a big, complicated city, people are sort of like, yes, please just tax me and solve these problems for me. You know what I mean? Like meaning that I do believe there is something about cities, that they're big, they're complicated, and people are just sort of like, yeah, like I'm very open to having a robust social apparatus to solve these problems, because I don't really want to do it, you know?
You just raised there's an obvious follow-up here though, which is that if that is true, then why haven't these cities, quote unquote, solved this issue? Right.
Well,
Because
I'm
if we're
not saying
talking,
that's a whole other matter, you know what I mean? But I
Yeah.
just meant, you know, and then also cities are multicultural and stuff like that. And so of course they're going to have more sensitivity about that, just because they're, you know, have more neighbors, right? Anyway, bottom line is this: all the problems we're talking about are most intense in growing places, be they Minneapolis, Nashville, or San Francisco and New York, places that have a lot of wealth and a lot of, you know, and a lot of activity. And it's increasingly happening in places like Dallas and Houston, and Atlanta, which really are the cities of America's future, or cities of the present and the future. And, you know, because that's where a lot of people are moving, but they're increasingly having these problems, and they're running out of land, and you can sort of see this. You're kind of like, better get ahead of it, because I know what's coming. And they have just as many NIMBYs as anyone else. But anyway, my point is that you don't see this. You see a different problem in Detroit and Youngstown, Ohio, in these decaying sort of post-industrial cities that have had a really tough time with either the loss of agriculture or the loss of manufacturing jobs, other things too, but that's like the main stereotype. You know, those sorts of cities they do also have housing problems, but they're very different. And so I think principally what I'm writing about is places that I think of as places where opportunity is great and the sort of jobs of the future lie.
So this is something I'm wondering about. There's a billion things to go over, and I really suggest that people check the book out, just because there's all these intertwined things. So we can't hit every single one, but what I'm also interested in is the role of the tech industry in this debate, because I get a little frustrated. So we had Brad Stone, who has covered Amazon, we had Alec.
Oh yeah, I know.
So
Brad. Me and Brad went to a Giants game together once.
Small. Once again, these worlds are shockingly small. Well, actually, unshockingly small is a better way to put it. But so we've dealt a lot with the Amazon discourse, and the Amazon discourse is, you know, Amazon comes in, tech companies come in, and they make everything expensive, this, and that. But when it comes to the corporate issues, especially, and you cover this in your book, I actually know Sonia, who you go into, people in these cities like San Francisco Bay Area, a lot of the YIMBYs, the people who want to quote unquote build more housing, the people who are most, hey, like, it's expensive here, we don't like that it's expensive here, let's change the policies, they tend to come from the tech industry. Like, I don't know anyone in the tech industry, especially in the Bay Area, who I would describe as being a NIMBY, like a not in my backyard person. So I guess I've always, could you, so
you don't know
I need that nuance, because I just get very frustrated, because I think people are lazy about the tech causes things to get more expensive debate. And I would like some nuance to that, because it just doesn't reflect my like personal experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. It's always easier to focus on what's happening right in front of you than it is to sort of think back, like, how did this really happen? What are the structural issues? Whatever, right? And don't get me wrong, what's happening right in front of you often is the problem. You know, but not always. And so let me just start with some background. Again, you can edit all this out if you want. It's important to remember that the Bay Area has been the center of the tech industry for a really long time. You could argue going back to like the World War II, you could, you know, at least the 50s and 60s, right? You know what I mean? Like Intel and all those companies were being developed in the 60s in the Bay Area. That was preceded by Fairchild Semiconductor, right? So this has been a part of our community and our business sort of base for a long time, right? And I'm not saying it was as big as it was, but I'm just saying that has been our thing. The reason the Bay Area has prospered so much has been because it was a tech hub, and that has been true since I'm 43. That has been true for much longer than my life, right? Mm-hmm. On top of that, the Bay Area tech industry and the sort of counterculture elements of the Bay Area have a lot of crossover with each other. The internet was developed as this decentralized platform in part because a bunch of hippies designed it. And I don't mean that as like a flippant joke. There's a whole book called What the Dormouse Said that meticulously documents the crossover between counterculture people like Stuart Brand and the Whole Earth catalog, which you may or may not know anything about, and the tech industry. And if you look at some of the utopianism that Steve Jobs and people like that,
yeah, he was a Stuart Brand guy.
Yeah, that tradition and how it's passed down. These people from Google still kind of act like they're running like a nonprofit rather than a giant corporation. Like, that belief, that meaning, the way that these people all have to, think that it's not just about a business, but, right. A lot of that comes from this, like, even the people who don't know it, a lot of that comes from that tradition. So I guess what I'm saying is, like, let's just remember that the tech industry is us. I mean, shoot, think so many of the people who are anti-tech are tech. I have literally been in arguments where you see a Google engineer fighting with a Google engineer over like gentrification. And like not remote. Now that's more at the like democratic socialist versus YIMBYs level. So it's like there's a sort of like college privilege kind of crew happening there, But anyway, I just think it's good to remember. It's not this outside force that just showed up. You know what I mean? Like the whole development of the region and that industry have happened in concert. And I think that there are aspects of the region that made tech flower there. And I think there are aspects of tech that have made it wealthy. You know what I mean? I think they've worked together. I think that tech has become much more visible because it's become much bigger. And it has also more specifically become much bigger in the city of San Francisco. Twitter, a lot of these tech companies, Twitter, Uber, are now actually based in the city of San Francisco. And so they're sort of like the sort of more, shall we say, boisterous political culture of San Francisco is sort of much more directly against tech. It's not like San Francisco activists in the 60s and 70s were like going down to Palo Alto to complain about, you know what I mean? For those people who don't know, I mean, the Silicon Valley is like not that close. It's like 40 miles away.
Really bad with traffic.
Yeah, well, it's funny. This is a whole other thing. But I always say, like, there's this whole experience people have when they land in San Francisco airport and they drive into the vaunted Silicon Valley and they're like, wait, this is it? It just looks like some like strip mall of Phoenix. You know what I mean? Like it's like this very
good way. I was in Phoenix for that's a very good way of putting it.
No, that's what it feels like. I mean, you go inside the offices and they're impressive and well designed, but the basic gist of it is like strip malls and office parks and single family neighborhoods, right? Anyway, so I guess what I'm saying is that I think a couple things have happened. I think it has run into the sort of political culture of San Francisco because it is much more based in the actual city of San Francisco now. And I think also, and this is where a place where I do think tech does deserve a lot of blame. I wouldn't say blame, but responsibility. There are things like tech buses, which obviously became a big flashpoint in the gentrification wars, right? Now, leave aside tech buses. Like, you and I could have a very logical conversation.
Can you explain what those are? I know what you're, yeah.
Okay. So there are these large buses these luxury sort of, this is obviously before the pandemic, these luxury, kind of coach double-decker
best Wi-Fi you've ever seen.
Yes, best Wi-Fi. And they say G bus and things on them. And they come and they pick people up in neighborhoods and then take them down to the Silicon Valley. And the reason is a lot of Silicon Valley people now want to live in San Francisco and they have to get to work in Mountain View. So there's a couple. Now we could have you and I could have a very logical discussion about this. Well, this is a company trying to get access to talent that they can't get in Silicon Valley. Well, is it better that they have one bus or 100 cars on the road? Well, if public transit was better, they wouldn't have this problem. Well, we could logically parse that out. We could come up with some kumbaya policy solution, right? But if you're and in the meantime, if you're a company, you're like, I got to solve this tomorrow, send a bus, right? Okay. But I think that that attitude, there's a problem tomorrow, I got to send a bus, feels discordant to people in a neighborhood because they're like, you know what? Our public transit sucks. Why isn't the like biggest corporation like really working hard on that? You know, it starts to feel like people are opting out of the collective good, that they're opting out of public services, that they're opting out of these things that we share, right? And so,
Can I understand that real quick? Because, so for example, there are, tech founders like Patrick Collison of Stripe who are very activisty
yeah,
around
I've
housing. He
had
like
lots of talks
specifically
with
mentioned
Patrick.
moving
Yeah.
from SF. So in that category though, when you say people feel like the companies aren't solving, I guess we should take a step back and think about what people like the idea of something versus the actual thing is probably the idea of thing. The idea is that, look, our public transportation is garbage. It doesn't feel like our city is well funded. And we get the sense that these corporations aren't paying their fair share for a variety of reasons versus like it's the actual people think that like, wait a second, it's the literal job of you kind of get what I'm getting at. I'm just trying to
No. Oh
understand
no. So
how people
that's
are feeling.
so we could talk about that. That's actually a great um segue to something. So basically, anyway, but the bottom line is, since it's a podcast, I'm going on and on, maybe too much. But
No, it's great.
one of the things is I think that people blame tech because it's grown a huge amount. I think because it's more centered in the city of San Francisco, and I think because there have been things like public buses and Ubers and things that really sort of have tried that sort of portray a kind of privatization of the world. I will also say that the tech industry has sort of adopted this like prominently Mark Andreessen and stuff like that. I don't think this is widespread true, but like this kind of more libertarian tone. The creator of Silicon Valley, that show, Mike Judge, he told someone, this was in a New Yorker article, that he really felt like what that show was really about was the conflict between the new libertarian Silicon Valley and the old hippie Silicon Valley. That was like the conflict at the center of the show, that sort of like ideological, and I thought, that's so interesting because that does feel at times like on a very high philosophical level, like what part of the like, I remember someone once told me, a friend of mine who hates tech, he was like, is a skater I know, and because I'm a skateboarder, in case you didn't know that, and he was like, it's not the nerds that bother me, it's the MBAs I can't stand. And I thought, like, that's like a funny, don't get me wrong, there are plenty, anyway, it just was a funny way to put it, right?
Well, there's some weird, it's funny because
Well, let me give you another example.
please.
Sorry. Did you see that whole thing where like there was a huge video that went around where there was a couple guys from the company, I think it was Box or Dropbox or one of those, and they had reserved a soccer field. They'd like gone online, and of course the kids who play at that soccer field there every day, what the hell, you reserve the soccer field, right? And that's this like I think that speaks to the kind of privatization, the like sort of, we got ahead of you in line because we figured out how to like, reserve it online,
Not
anyway.
quite knowing the culture of the space you're in.
Yeah, it's like, what? Anybody who actually plays soccer here knows we play soccer here on Saturdays. Like, I don't care that you went to the city's website to sort of reserve the field today. You know what I mean? Like, and I think that there is that sort of privatization thing. And I think also there's this feeling that people feel like something's been lost. Now, we can talk about housing. I think that the fact that, anyway, you were saying something, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I just
I just want to, I get my one chance to offer a little nuance here. And I think that the example, I really like Mark Andreessen, and he's an interesting case because
I like him too. I just meant I understand he is not like a full-on hippie the way the old dudes were.
Oh, totally. And I think and just in the sense that he's the definition of someone who isn't the Stanford MBA. The nuance I think I would add to the critique is that like there's like the Stanford MBA type who migrated from who would have gone to Wall Street 2 decades ago, but it's come to the Bay Area because that's more of a thing. And Mark Andreessen also, interestingly, he had a great essay, Time to Build, that really focused a lot on the housing issues there. But
you mentioned my book in it.
Yeah, we see. No, it's as we're nearing the end here, what I'm curious about is I feel like you've given a really strong picture of what the broad space is, like what the narratives are. We've had a year of COVID, so there's all these narratives around whether cities are over. They're obviously not. I moved to New York. That means something. I know a lot of folks who were digital nomads the past year who are desperate to get to New York or Miami or Austin. So that really says something about the resiliency of human nature. Where do you think all of this goes? Because the most interesting, fascinating thing I really caught, and once again, you had to seriously, I'd love everyone, if everyone basically could go and just read the preface of your book, because that's how I outlined the show, it just hits everything everyone needs to hear. And the point you made is that since the 1970s, there's actually been a lot of ideological consensus around what someone needs to do to address this issue, why the issue happens, all those parts. And in many ways, what the book actually is, I think I'm close to quoting from you, is an exploration of the forces and people that have actually prevented that consensus from actually getting implemented. So, where do you think any listener who's interested in this topic? I picked it because it's something I just organically see from folks, people who write in with questions, Twitter, just friends back home on your old Facebook feed that you don't really check that often. Everyone's talking about this. So, just where does this go from here? Because nothing's more depressing than going back and reading policy papers from the late 90s that basically say whatever we could say now. It's not as if there's been an innovative new
Yeah.
housing paper in the last year or so.
Well, I think it's important to. So I have some. Are you saying is there something they should go back and read from that time?
Well,
That
just what, where does this go? I mean, I feel
oh
like
yes,
any listener's reaction to our conversation is going to be, okay, like we get it. We kind of already knew this was bad. Where does this go?
yes. So I will note. I always show this to people and they always love it. So hopefully your viewers will feel the same. If you go Google this, Google changing San Francisco for seen as a haven for wealthy and childless, or I think that's what it is. Um, that was a New York Times article that ran in 1981, and you're like, oh, I guess they got it.
Yeah.
So okay, a couple things are happening. One is around the country, there's been a lot of movement on adding light density. So Minneapolis outlawed single family zoning. You can now build 3 homes on a lot, three units on one lot. A number of cities have added these ADU laws, which allow you to build backyard cottages. But essentially, some of them are pretty substantial, so you can build like an apartment in them. And so there's a lot of ways in which we are starting to move on developing single family home neighborhoods a little bit more. And I think that's a gentle movement, and B, it sort of shows like there are now people building these. There's now real stuff happening there. There's now like on the negative side, you now have investors bidding out people for their single family homes. But there's started to be some neighborhoods will start to change a little bit, and maybe people will find that they're not that bad. I think you were starting to see like President Biden, President Obama, even to some extent President Trump, were all spoke a little bit about this issue. There was in the Democratic debate before the nomination, Democratic primary, there was a couple of housing questions. All of the candidates felt like they had to have a housing plan, which even if they're just bullet points, the fact that their advisors, I mean, I've talked to these people and I remember one of their advisors said like, I never felt like I had to have a housing plan before, you know what I mean? And now we do. So that's something. But I think the most important thing that's happened and is happening is this sort of sociological change where younger people are kind of, I mean, under 40 and even older too, but where people are starting to like we need enough housing for people as a value. It's like a value the way like I care about the environment became a value in the 70s. That wasn't something that people held. Obviously there was conservationism and stuff like that, but like a sort of broad-based, I am worried about the environment. It was not like a huge social value shared pretty widely throughout the United States until like the 70s or 80s, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm gonna just give you kind of a stupid example, but I think it's an important one. I live in Rockridge, which is a like nice neighborhood of Oakland. I'm the NIMBY neighborhood of Oakland. I'm not saying, but and we have this like little land commission. We have a little like it's called I forget exactly what it's called, community planning council or something like that. And it's like this body that has no real power, but they can advise the city on certain things. But it ends up being like a voice for how the neighborhood feels about things. And there was just like a really raucous election for this little board that most people don't care about, where you have to go to our little library. And I mean, this is just for our neighborhood. And it was the like very pro housing people like ran a slate. There was all these articles about it in our little like the little newspaper they throw on your doorstep. And there was this like really fierce debate over, no, we are going to start trying to be like a more affirmative, and this is like the NIMBY neighborhood of Oakland, we're going to try to be more affirmative housing. Also, there's like a little farmer's market near me, and somebody wants to build a 19-story building on a college campus that's a little behind me. So it's back there. It's not like in the middle of a single family home. And there's of course like a booth at the farmer's market, and it's like, stop the tower, and people will walk up to it. And it's not every person, it's not even every third person, but like a noticeable minority of people, I sort of go and eavesdrop because I'm so interested in housing, will come and say, well, we need the housing, So I think and Mark Andreessen writes his build essay. So I feel like there's starting to be like a value that, we needed more housing, that being on the side of more housing is like a good way to be, and I think as that sort of like bakes in, as that locks in, you'll start to see just things loosen up a bit. So more so than policy, I think the policy will follow from that. I think that, and so I don't think that will change tomorrow. But I mean, on the negative side, NIMBYism is becoming more of a broadly, like I've seen a lot of people start to refer to themselves as Jeffersonian. The guy who did that thread that you were talking about on Twitter, the one about Wall Street, JD Vance wrote this whole thing about. And then I've seen a lot of people in California who are, technically liberal type people call themselves Jeffersonian. So there's starting to be this sort of ideological counterbalance as well. But anyway, my point is that I do think that the thinking is starting to change. And I think that thinking will be I think that thinking will prove to be more profound than you think. Because people keep these values their whole lives. It's like people became environmentalists in the 70s and they still vote for whatever the Sierra Club has endorsed in their local election, like no matter what. They don't think about it. They don't whatever, in many cases vote for things that might even be anti-environment, like Sierra Club has not been very good on density. So I think that the sort of broad-based kind of development of worrying about housing and wanting more housing and there to be more housing options and not being so precious about your neighborhood, I think that's starting to become like a real value. And I think that as it sort of like defines people's kind of, as they get older and more influential, I think it will start to be a real thing.
So last actual question, because I do have to, there's a decent number of Jeffersonians in this audience, so they will murder me if I don't ask this question.
Yeah. I don't think Jeffersonian has to mean how certain people mean it. I'm just saying, I'm starting to see it be adopted the way.
Oh, no, and I saw this in DC. There's actually, what's funny is NIMBYism, so not in my backyard, is being kind of reclaimed by certain people in the sense of, what's the matter with that? NIMBYism means that we as a town could decide what we want to look like. And there are all these neoliberal libertarians who are coming in trying to impose their vision on us. So I think it's important to advise. So here's let's finish just then with this. What I agree with you that the movement, especially in a variety of states and cities, is pushing towards building more. The more we're talking about housing as an issue, just is going to push that in the direction of the building more position. What do you think the backlash to this looks like? Because the key thing is like it's a policy area, so it's a pendulum. And if you're saying that your read is that this is swinging more towards construction and less towards the homeowner, often liberal. So this isn't like a blue tribe, red tribe thing. If the pendulum is swinging away from San Francisco homeowner who's owned that house since the 40s and it's really nice, what is their backlash going to look like?
All right. Let me just quickly say to the people who identify as Jeffersonian that I did not mean that as a knock on that so much. I think of Jeffersonian as kind of meaning like small ownership and distributed power to some extent. You know, everybody having a stake, and Jefferson sort of idealizing it in family farms or land. You know, but everyone having a stake in the sort of capital structure of the society, right? And I think that there are people who are, you know, say YIMBYs, who might profess that same value, maybe not articulate it quite the same way, but they're like, I am locked out. I'm a renter for life right now. If you build a duplex, maybe I can own something, right? So I have actually met some YIMBYs who have said, not like YIMBYs, the kind you see in San Francisco, but I've met people who are very pro-housing in California who have identified themselves as Jeffersonians because they want ownership. So I'm not saying it as a knock. I'm just saying I've started to see, and I think, and also I should note, fearing banks owning every house in America, whatever, that's like not a irrational thing.
It's not a crazy instinct.
Yeah, you know what I mean? Like, so I think that those two things can be compatible with building more housing. This is a great wrap-up question because the power broker is on your shelf, and we talked about it at the beginning. And if you think about it, the power broker is really about this one guy who basically completely redeveloped New York, totally redeveloped the parkways, the freeways, the housing with almost no opposition whatsoever because he was a king. You know, he somehow got enough power that literally he could rebuild all of New York and nobody could stop him or challenge him in any way. I think of NIMBYism and the rational NIMBYism as a very rational reaction to that type of planning. You know, Robert Moses is the thing in New York, but there were versions of that in every city in America. There were freeway wars in every city in America. San Francisco's kind of NIMBY architecture began over a fight over a freeway. So the same things that happened in the power broker happened everywhere. And I think that, you know, the pendulum, so you read about, he's writing about, we're sort of seeing the pendulum go too far the other way, but at the beginning, it was probably the right thing, right? And I think, what will it look like? It will look like haphazard planning. It will look like, it'll look like this nasty world where everyone's still driving, but there aren't enough parking spaces. So I think there will be a chaotic urbanity to it. And I think the backlash will, I don't know I can't tell you what the backlash will look like. I just know that there will be one. I mean, I guess it'll look like more control, more, I don't know. I mean, I suppose the easy, unsexy thing to say to you is that if rules get more liberalized to make it easier to build, they'll get less liberalized to make it harder to build, right? You know, but I also think that we're at the beginning. I think that when I'm like 60 or sorry, unfortunately, when I'm like 80, you and I will be talking about that.
Yeah. Well, Conor, thank you so much. This is such a great place to leave things. Really appreciate it. Everyone, please check out Golden Gates, The Housing Crisis, and the Reckoning for the American Dream. It's a great book. Really helped inform this conversation. Thank you so much.
Cool. Thank you. Bye.